The NASCAR Cup Series heads back to the high banks of Daytona one more time in 2024 with a playoff position potentially on the line. I'm joined now by Greg Mathern from wintherace.info. Greg, it's been a while. Hope you're doing well. I want to start things off by talking about Ford. Last Superspeedway race was Talladega. We remember this. 3 Fords were leading coming out of turn 4. McDowell makes the block. A Toyota ends up in victory lane. But specifically RFK Racing, both cars finished in the top 6 at Michigan this past weekend. In the past, we've seen Chris Buescher and Brad Keselowski work together to dominate these style of races. But if you look at the numbers this year, they've only led 7 laps each across Daytona, Atlanta, and Talladega. So what's going on with RFK? Is there any reason to believe that maybe that traditional Roush speed will be back this Saturday night?
Well, it's good to be back. And yeah, it's an interesting question with, RFK, as you said, they have traditionally run really well here, particularly if we go back and we look at the Daytona 500 last year. They both led a, pretty significant chunk of laps, looked like they could be in contention. We always talk about, Brad Keselowski as one of the all-time great drafters. So they've faded off for whatever reason. It's hard to say. As you said, they've each only had those 7 laps. If we look at their average running position, it's been pretty middling as well. At Daytona and Talladega over the past 6 race for Brad, it's been an 18.7 running position. So it's really hard to say exactly what's going on. I think some of it is just the randomness of these races, right? You see drivers who will pop up and pop down. So they're both towards the 50% mark at those numbers. So I think we could see them come back, but it definitely is interesting that they've not necessarily been as far up front as we would normally expect them to be at these tracks.
You wonder if it has anything to do maybe with the sudden focus on fuel mileage racing now. Like 2022, they swept the duels at Daytona. Last year in this race, Chris Buescher won the Coke Zero Sugar 400 with a push from Brad Keselowski. But this year, we've seen heavy fuel saving in the stages, even the final run of the race that's really jostled up the running order. You wonder if there's something there. When you're going flat out full throttle, the RFK guys are as faster than anyone. But when it comes to fuel saving and the field gets jostled up, it's depending on where you fall in line, it's tough to make up all that track position in the final stage with how hard it is to get that third lane truly developed with this car. That's my theory, at least, is maybe there's something there. But we can expect Ford to be fast. We'll talk more about some of the underdog favorites maybe in a few moments. But I just want to ask you, Greg, more broadly about the data. This obviously is an analytical preview. It's hard to use data sometimes to predict what will happen at Daytona, but is there any correlation between drivers, their average running position and who's up front towards the end? What's the best position in the pack to be in late in the race to have a shot at winning? I asked this, and I know I'm rambling, but because I go back and watch the finish to this year's Daytona 500, and the big crash with several laps to go happens up front and took out 3 or 4 of the best cars. And then I watched Talladega in the spring, and it was a fairly clean race until the final 300 yards. So I don't know, is there any interesting data that jumps out at you about this style of racing?
Well, as you said, it's interesting because speed doesn't really matter so much at these races, obviously, right? As long as you can hang with the draft, you can probably put yourself in a position. It's not like when we look at even Michigan, where, you do have a little bit of drafting at sometimes, where at the end you have to have that raw speed to kind of jump out and go, right? Because you can get out in front and run. And we don't have that here. But it is interesting what you said. You do actually need to be up front, despite the potential for calamity. If we look at the 10 races that we've had in the Gen 7 car at Daytona and Talladega, of those 10 races, the winner has been inside the top 10 at the 90% mark of the race in 8 of 10 times, right? The other 2 times, the winner was in 11th. That was the Daytona 500 that Ricky Stenhouse won. And in 14th, when Kyle Busch won at Talladega. So you've got to be in position. Yes, there's risk there. Yes, there's some randomness to, what happens. As you said, you could be at Talladega like we were earlier this year and have 4 guys take out, the front of the field. But again, the winner still came from inside that top 10 because that's where Tyler Reddick was, and he was in that position. So you've got to be up front at the end. In the Gen 7, we've not seen somebody in that last couple of laps of the race kind of slingshot to the front. We don't have the tandem drafting anymore. We haven't seen somebody come from the back half of the field over the past couple of laps and just launch himself forward, at least in the Cup Series. So you've got to be up front. And not only do you have to be up front at the end, you need to be right there most of the race. Again, if we're looking at those 10 different winners that we've had here, 9 of the 10 have been inside the top 50% of average running position for the entire race. The only exception was Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and he was just outside the top 50%. So you've got to be up there. You've got to put yourself in position to win. Yes, there's some risk there, but you can't win if you're not in that position. And like I said, we're just not seeing kind of those slingshot moves that maybe we saw in yesteryear, getting people to launch all the way to the front.
Yeah, gone are the days of Dale Earnhardt going 18th to 1st in a short stretch to get the win. Not with this car, not with this rules package, not with all the fuel mileage racing we see nowadays. It's just unlikely to happen. I want to ask you this, Greg, because you did say something to me. You point out a stat before we started recording about how many different winners we have seen at Superspeedway style races in the last 2.5 years since the Gen 7 car was introduced. And a lot is made of Denny Hamlin, one of the best super speedway racers of the previous generation. He's winless at super speedways in the next gen car. And you point out a couple of other interesting stats. I don't know if you have them off the cuff still, but I thought that was really interesting. You pointing out how, again, not random, but how there's been no clear speedway dominance in this car by any driver or manufacturer.
Yeah, it's interesting. We in our mind, we think of certain drivers as like, oh, these are the super speedway kind of dominators, the guys that we're going to consistently expect to win over and over and over again. The four that normally jump out in my mind are Brad Keselowski, Denny Hamlin, Joey Logano, Ryan Blaney. You want to throw a fifth in there, Chase Elliott. We've normally thought of as a guy who's really
Yeah.
good at this package. We have 10 different winners in 10 races at Daytona and Talladega. So it's not been any of these repeat winners. It's been interesting in that sense. And even if you want to throw Atlanta in there, then yeah, okay, if we throw Atlanta in there, we get some guys who have won at Atlanta and at one of these tracks. Your William Byron, who's done both of those. He's done really, really well at the new Atlanta, but it's not been the same guys dominating. You do have guys who have led a lot of laps who have been up front, but none of them have managed to seal the deal more than once. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of how that continues to play out if we're almost seeing more randomness in this with this new package, with the super high downforce, the lower horsepower, everything that goes into that, if that has just kind of equalized the field even more. And even with that aggressiveness that we've seen out of, some of these drivers who have been consistently good, if, maybe the field's just too equal to consistently pop off those wins at this track type.
I mean, yeah, you said it. 10 different winners in 10 Daytona Talladega Gen 7 races. So my final question then, Greg, we can go back and forth on this. Everyone's looking at the playoff picture. We thought Austin Dillon had got a win at Richmond to qualify. Obviously, that's been rescinded, the playoff eligibility at least. But going into this race, Kyle Busch, he's a Talladega winner with RCR. Todd Gilliland, I got my eye on him. He led 74 laps combined between Daytona and Atlanta in the spring. His teammate, Michael McDowell, is a Daytona 500 winner. Are there any of those guys or any other drivers that we may consider outside the playoff picture who have the best chance at surprising us this Saturday?
Well, Kyle Busch has to be the number one that we're looking at and targeting. Over at Win the Race, we look at our, consensus, pre-qualifying ranks. We normally call them pre-practice and qualifying, but we obviously don't have practice this week. And Kyle Busch is our number one. And it kind of, I think, shocked a lot of people. It shocked myself, actually, even when I was looking at it. I didn't necessarily expect that. But when we look at the stats, it makes a certain amount of sense. If we look at average running position across those 10 races in the Gen 7 car, Kyle Busch has the second best average running position of anyone in the Cup Series in those. He's got an average running position of 13.04.
Wow.
Which is second only to Chase Elliott at 12.92. So
Yeah, I would not
he's
have guessed
been
that.
up front. He's had that ability. He obviously did get the win at Talladega. So he's definitely one to keep an eye on. I think of the kind of second tier super speedway drivers, I think he's the one that we want to be looking, the most at. It's interesting because there are, as you said, like some guys that we think of as really good super speedway racing. But then when I kind of dug into the stats some, it's interesting. Yes, they have the ability, but there's some inconsistency. Chief among those, Michael McDowell. We normally think of him as like, oh, historically, drafting was Michael McDowell's thing. And obviously, we've seen him really come into his own on some other stuff. But if we look at drafting, he's actually way down in average running position
Wow.
at these tracks in the Gen 7. His average running position over the past 2 years at these tracks is 21.82. It puts him well into the back half of the field in that respect. So there are races where he pops up to the front, but then there are races where he's just middling in the back. He's very inconsistent. We see kind of the same thing with Todd Gilliland, another one who's kind of tossed out of there like, hey, we've seen a whole lot from him. We saw him lead a ton of laps at Atlanta, obviously, earlier this year. We saw him be up front in the Daytona 500 this year. He had a shot to win both of those races. He had the ability to do it. But again, when we look at his average running position at these tracks over the past 2 years, 20.47. Again, well towards the back of the field. It's an inconsistency there. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind with some of these other drivers that we think of as kind of the second tier experts. The other three that I think normally come into that category, Austin Dillon, Ricky Stenhouse, all have average running positions over 20. They are
Wow.
inconsistent. And so when we're trying to predict who's going to pop up, sure, we have to rate them and we have to consider them as having the ability. But I think people overvalue how good they are at these tracks because while they have the ability, they don't necessarily have the consistency that we see out of some other drivers, like, for example, one who no one thinks of, Martin Truex Jr., who has great consistency running up front, but just no finishes. He just has terrible luck at the end of the race.
Sounds about
So
right.
it's kind of interesting. We get in our predefined mindsets of who these people are and what their skill set is, and then when we try and dig into the stats some, we have to reconsider like, oh, is it that we've seen those flashes of brilliance and that's coloring our mind? So we do want to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. It's if any of these guys we just named are in the top 10 late, they have a very good shot at winning, but it's so hard to predict if any of them will be in the top 10 late because of that inconsistency you're talking about. Should be a really interesting race at Daytona this weekend. A lot on the line for so many guys. Greg, thank you so much for being on the show, folks. You can find more of Greg's work at wintherace.info. He also writes for thedailydownforce.com. Greg, thank you so much for being on the show. We'll talk to you again sometime soon, man.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Eric.